A black woman lies in the hospital bleeding and in desperate need of care, but the doctor in charge dismisses her. He moves on to other patients, ignoring her cries for help. Just as hope begins to fade, she reaches into her pocket and reveals something that shocks the entire room: a federal badge. Now the doctor is forced to confront not just his actions, but the truth about who she is and the power she holds. What happens when the tables turn? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn night wrapped around Carol Johnson like a cool blanket as she stepped out of First Baptist Church. Her heart felt full from the evening's fellowship, and the gentle hymns still echoed in her mind. Small groups of trick-or-treaters dotted the sidewalks, their colorful costumes bringing a smile to her tired face. "Good night, Sister Carol," called out Deacon Williams from the church steps. "Drive safe now." Carol waved back, her silver bracelet catching the streetlight. "You too. Happy Halloween." The words came out with the warmth that always seemed to radiate from her, even when fatigue tugged at her edges after a long day of work followed by evening worship. Settling into her navy blue minivan, Carol adjusted her seatbelt and checked her mirrors, a habit ingrained from 30 years of careful driving. The dashboard clock read 8:45 p.m. The streets were quieter now, with most of the younger children already home counting their candy. As she drove along the familiar route home, Carol hummed Amazing Grace softly to herself. The streetlights created pools of yellow light on the asphalt, and dried leaves skittered across her path in the gentle breeze. She was looking forward to a cup of chamomile tea, and maybe a small piece of the pumpkin bread Sister Martinez had shared after service. Just past the Miller Creek Bridge, where the road curved alongside a row of maple trees, Carol saw headlights in her peripheral vision. Something wasn't right. The approaching car was weaving erratically, crossing the center line. "Lord have mercy," Carol whispered, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. She tried to edge toward the shoulder, but it happened too fast. The other car, a red sedan, swerved sharply. Metal screamed against metal as it slammed into the driver's side of Carol's minivan. The impact sent her vehicle spinning, tires screeching against the pavement. Everything became a blur of motion and noise. When the world stopped spinning, Carol found herself gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles had gone pale. Sharp pain radiated from her left shoulder, and something warm trickled down her forehead. In the rearview mirror, she could see a small cut above her eyebrow, blood slowly making its way down her face. "Jesus, give me strength," she murmured, trying to steady her trembling hands. The other car had come to rest against a guardrail about 50 feet back. Through her side mirror, she could see its driver stumbling out, seemingly unhurt. Carol took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. Her minivan was still running, and despite the damage, it seemed drivable. Years of watching the news had taught her that waiting alone on a dark road wasn't always the safest choice. She remembered passing the highway patrol station just a few minutes before the bridge. It couldn't be more than a mile ahead. Carefully, she tested the gas pedal. The van moved forward smoothly enough, though it pulled slightly to the left. Through the pain and shock, Carol remembered her father's words from long ago. "If you're ever in trouble, baby girl, find the police station. That's what they're there for." She guided the damaged vehicle forward, her heart still racing. Every few seconds, she checked her mirrors, making sure the other driver wasn't following. The cut on her forehead stung, and her shoulder throbbed with each small movement. But Carol kept driving, her prayers a constant whisper. The highway patrol station's lights appeared ahead like a beacon of hope. Carol's hands were shaking as she turned into the well-lit parking lot, carefully maneuvering her battered minivan into a space near the entrance. The familiar blue and white patrol cars provided an immediate sense of safety, and she could see officers moving about inside the building. As she put the van in park, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. Carol's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, focusing instead on the task at hand. She needed help, and she had found it. That was what mattered right now. The highway patrol officers rushed out to meet Carol as she carefully opened her van door. Officer Martinez, a young woman with concerned eyes, immediately noticed the blood on Carol's face and clothing. "Ma'am, please stay seated," Officer Martinez said, gently placing a hand on Carol's uninjured shoulder. We'll get you help right away." Her partner, Officer Thompson, was already on his radio calling for an ambulance. The fluorescent lights of the station cast harsh shadows across Carol's damaged vehicle, revealing the full extent of the impact on the driver's side. "Can you tell us what happened, ma'am?" Officer Martinez asked, pulling out a small notepad while keeping a watchful eye on Carol's condition. Carol's voice trembled slightly as she recounted the incident. "I was driving home from church, just past Miller Creek Bridge, and this car came out of nowhere." She paused, touching her forehead where the blood had begun to dry. "It swerved right into my lane." Officer Thompson joined them, his face grave. "The ambulance is on its way. Did you happen to see the other vehicle? Any details you can remember?" "A red sedan," Carol said, her shoulder throbbing more intensely now. I saw the driver get out after the crash. They seemed okay." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within minutes, an ambulance pulled into the station's parking lot, its red and white lights painting everything in alternating colors. 2 EMTs quickly approached with their equipment. "We'll need your contact information, Mrs. Johnson," Officer Martinez said, "and we'll follow you to the hospital." As the EMTs began their preliminary examination, Carol provided her details through gritted teeth. The pain in her shoulder had grown worse, and the cut on her forehead had started bleeding again. "Blood pressure's elevated," one EMT announced to his partner. "Possible shoulder dislocation. Let's get her on the stretcher." With careful movements, they helped Carol onto the stretcher. Officer Martinez squeezed her hand gently. "We'll be right behind you, Mrs. Johnson. Don't worry about anything right now." The ride to the emergency room was a blur of motion and muffled voices. Carol focused on her breathing, the way her pastor had taught her during meditation sessions. "In through the nose, out through the mouth," she whispered to herself. True to their word, the patrol officers arrived at the hospital just as the EMTs were wheeling Carol through the ER entrance. The fluorescent lights seemed even harsher here, and the antiseptic smell made her nose twitch. 55-year-old female MVA victim, the EMT reported to the waiting staff. Laceration to the forehead, possible left shoulder dislocation, BP 160/90. Dr. Warner, the on-duty physician, approached the stretcher. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and quick, efficient movements. His penlight flashed across Carol's eyes as he checked her pupils. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Can you follow my finger with your eyes?" Carol complied, though the movement made her slightly dizzy. The doctor's finger moved left, then right, then up and down. "Good," Dr. Warner said, now examining the cut on her forehead. "This is going to need stitches. How's your pain level, on a scale of 1 to 10? 7, Carol admitted, the throbbing in her shoulder making it hard to concentrate. "Maybe 8? The doctor nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Let's get her to Bay 3, he instructed the nurses. "I want a full set of x-rays on that shoulder, and let's start her on some pain management." Officers Martinez and Thompson stood nearby, their presence reassuring as Carol was wheeled deeper into the emergency department. The last thing she saw before being taken through the double doors was Officer Martinez giving her an encouraging smile. Dr. Miller strode into the emergency department, his white coat crisp despite the late hour. His eyes swept over the patients, landing briefly on Carol, before moving to a young man hobbling in through the entrance, supported by laughing friends in Halloween costumes. "What do we have?" Dr. Miller asked, approaching the group rather than Carol's stretcher. "Just twisted my ankle at a party," the young man said, grimacing but still managing to smile. "Tried to do a backflip off the porch. Stupid, right?" Dr. Miller's attention remained fixed on the partygoer. "Get him to Bay 1, he ordered, then glanced at Carol's attending nurse. "Mrs. Johnson can wait. She's stable." The nurse hesitated, looking at Carol's blood-stained clothing. "Sir, she has a head injury and—" "I said she can wait," Dr. Miller interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Carol's vision began to blur around the edges as she lay on the stretcher. The fluorescent lights above seemed to pulse in and out of focus. Her shoulder felt like it was on fire, and the dried blood on her forehead had begun to itch. Officers Martinez and Thompson exchanged worried glances. They'd seen enough emergency situations to know this wasn't right. Martinez pulled out her phone and checked the emergency contact information Carol had provided. Sandra Bennett, Martinez read softly to her partner. Listed as next of kin. We should call her. Thompson nodded, watching as Carol's eyes fluttered closed momentarily before opening again. Make the call. Martinez stepped away from the stretcher, dialing the number. The phone rang 3 times before a sharp, alert voice answered. This is Sandra Bennett. Ms. Bennett, this is Officer Martinez with the Highway Patrol. I'm calling about your aunt, Carol Johnson. She's been in an accident and is at Memorial Hospital. What? Sandra's voice tightened with concern. How bad is it? Martinez glanced at Carol, who was now visibly struggling to stay conscious. She needs medical attention, but... She lowered her voice. There seems to be some delay in treatment. I think it would be best if you could come quickly. I'm on my way, Sandra said firmly. Tell her to hang on. The officers returned to Carol's side. Her breathing had become shallow, and her skin had taken on an ashen tone. Thompson approached the nurse's station for the 3rd time. Excuse me, he said, trying to keep his voice level, but Mrs. Johnson really needs to be seen. She's not looking good. The nurse behind the desk looked troubled. I know, officer, but Dr. Miller's orders... From her stretcher, Carol could hear fragments of conversations around her, but they seemed to come from far away. The pain in her shoulder had become a distant throb, and she found herself drifting between awareness and darkness. She tried to focus on the cross hanging on the far wall, attempting to draw strength from her faith, but her vision kept blurring. Officer Martinez took Carol's hand, noticing how cold it felt. Your niece is coming, Mrs. Johnson. Just stay with us, okay? Carol managed a weak nod, but speaking felt like too much effort. She could see Dr. Miller in the distance, laughing with the young man from the party as he wrapped his ankle. The contrast between his attentive care there and his dismissal of her condition was stark, but Carol was too weak to feel angry. Instead, she silently prayed, not for herself, but for understanding. The officers maintained their vigil, watching helplessly as Carol's condition continued to deteriorate. They knew Sandra was on her way, but every minute felt like an hour as they waited, wondering how a Halloween night that had started with church services had turned into this nightmare of neglect. Sandra burst through the emergency room doors, her FBI windbreaker still half-zipped from her rush to get there. Her eyes scanned the hallway until they landed on her Aunt Carol, still lying on the stretcher where the officers had described. The sight made her blood run cold. Aunt Carol. Sandra rushed to her side, taking in the untreated wounds and her aunt's pallid complexion. Carol's eyes fluttered open briefly at the sound of her niece's voice, but she seemed too weak to speak. Officer Martinez stepped forward. She's been waiting over an hour now. No treatment. Sandra's jaw clenched as she watched blood still seeping from her aunt's forehead wound. She spun around, marching straight to the nurse's station. Who's in charge here? Why hasn't my aunt received any medical attention? A nurse looked up, uncomfortable. Dr. Miller is the attending physician tonight. He's with another patient at the moment. Get him, now. Sandra's voice was steel. Dr. Miller appeared from behind a curtain, barely glancing in their direction. We're quite busy tonight. Your aunt will be seen when we have availability. Sandra stepped directly into his path. My aunt has been bleeding for over an hour. She needs immediate medical attention. As I said, Dr. Miller replied dismissively, attempting to step around her. We'll get to her when we can. While you treat a twisted ankle? Sandra's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby staff and patients. I watched you spend 20 minutes wrapping that kid's foot while my aunt lies here bleeding. Dr. Miller's face hardened. I don't have to explain my medical decisions to you. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have security remove you. Sandra reached into her jacket and pulled out her FBI credentials, holding them up for everyone to see. I'm Special Agent Sandra Bennett, and I'm documenting every minute of this negligent treatment. Would you like to explain to a federal investigation why you're refusing to treat a critically injured black woman while prioritizing minor injuries? The emergency room fell silent. Dr. Miller's face flushed red, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. I'll treat her. Everyone turned to see a woman in scrubs approaching from the doctor's lounge. She had apparently been on break, but had overheard the confrontation. "Dr. Alvarez," she introduced herself, already moving toward Carol's stretcher. "I just finished my shift, but I'm still on call. Let's get her into Bay 3 immediately." "You can't just—" Dr. Miller started to protest, but Dr. Alvarez cut him off. "I can and I will," she said firmly, already checking Carol's vital signs. "Nurse Chen, get me a suture kit and start an IV. We need to check for internal injuries and get that bleeding under control." Sandra watched as Dr. Alvarez and her team quickly wheeled Carol into the treatment bay, feeling both relief and simmering anger. She turned back to Dr. Miller, who was trying to retreat to his office. "This isn't over," Sandra called after him. "Expect to hear from both the medical board and the FBI's Civil Rights Division." Officer Martinez stepped up beside her. "We'll be happy to provide statements about everything we witnessed tonight." Sandra nodded gratefully, then hurried to join her aunt in the treatment bay, where Dr. Alvarez was already working efficiently to address Carol's injuries. For the first time since receiving the call, Sandra felt her aunt was finally in good hands. Dr. Alvarez worked with swift precision, her experienced hands moving quickly as she assessed Carol's injuries. The treatment bay buzzed with focused energy as nurses responded to the doctor's rapid-fire instructions. "BP is dropping, doctor," Nurse Chen announced, attaching monitoring equipment to Carol's arm. "Start 2 large-bore IVs," Dr. Alvarez ordered, "and get me that head CT stat." She pressed fresh gauze against the wound on Carol's forehead, examining the depth of the laceration. "Mrs. Johnson, can you hear me? I need you to squeeze my hand if you can understand me." Carol's fingers twitched weakly around the doctor's hand. Sandra stood at the foot of the bed, her FBI training helping her maintain composure despite her racing heart. "That's good, Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Alvarez encouraged, using her penlight to check Carol's pupils. "The cut on your forehead needs immediate attention, and I'm concerned about that shoulder injury. We're going to take good care of you." The medical team moved like a well-orchestrated unit around Carol's bed. Nurse Chen hung IV fluids, while another nurse carefully cut away Carol's bloodied clothing to better assess her injuries. Dr. Alvarez maintained a steady stream of gentle communication with her patient, explaining each step as she worked. "Your niece is right here with you, Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Alvarez said, nodding toward Sandra. "She's making sure you're getting everything you need." Sandra's throat tightened with emotion as she watched her aunt receive the proper medical attention she should have gotten hours ago. The monitor's steady beeping provided a reassuring rhythm as Carol's vital signs began to stabilize under Dr. Alvarez's care. "Multiple lacerations on the left shoulder," Dr. Alvarez noted, examining the injury. "Looks like glass fragments. We'll need to clean this thoroughly." She glanced at Sandra. Was she wearing her seatbelt? "Yes," Sandra confirmed, her voice steady despite her worry. The other driver swerved into her lane. The driver's side window shattered on impact. Dr. Alvarez nodded, her focus unwavering as she worked. "The head CT will rule out any internal bleeding, but these cuts need immediate attention. Nurse Chen, prepare for sutures, and let's get some pain medication on board." Carol stirred slightly, her eyes opening. "Sandra?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Sandra moved quickly to her aunt's side, careful not to interfere with the medical team. "I'm right here, Aunt Carol. Dr. Alvarez is taking good care of you." "The CT scanner is ready," a technician announced from the doorway. "Excellent," Dr. Alvarez responded. "Mrs. Johnson, we're going to take you for a quick scan to check your head injury. Your niece can wait right here, and we'll be back in just a few minutes." Sandra watched as they wheeled her aunt's bed toward the door, Dr. Alvarez walking alongside, still monitoring Carol's vital signs. The doctor's competence and compassion stood in stark contrast to Dr. Miller's earlier negligence. Nurse Chen paused beside Sandra. "Dr. Alvarez is one of our best trauma specialists. Your aunt is in good hands now." Sandra nodded, her posture rigid with tension as she watched the treatment bay doors swing shut. The monitor's beeping faded as they moved down the hallway, leaving Sandra alone with her thoughts and the weight of what had almost happened due to one doctor's prejudice. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital window as Carol rested in her new room in the general ward. The steady rhythm of monitoring equipment provided a quiet backdrop to the occasional footsteps in the hallway outside. Sandra sat in a chair beside her aunt's bed, her FBI badge visible on her belt as she reviewed medical charts on her tablet. Carol stirred, her bandaged head turning slightly on the pillow. "Sandra, honey, you don't need to stay here all day. I'm feeling much better." "I'm not going anywhere, Aunt Carol," Sandra replied, reaching over to adjust her aunt's blanket. "Besides, I've already called in to take a few personal days." A nurse entered the room, her movement stiff and mechanical as she checked Carol's IV. She barely made eye contact, focusing solely on the medical equipment. "Good morning," Carol offered warmly despite the nurse's cold demeanor. The nurse merely nodded, making quick notes on her tablet before hurrying out. Sandra's jaw tightened. "Did you see that? They've all been like that since Dr. Alvarez went off duty. It's like they're afraid we're going to file a complaint." "Maybe they are," Carol said softly, wincing slightly as she shifted position. "But treating people poorly won't make anything better." Dr. Miller passed by the room's open door, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Sandra noticed how he quickened his pace, clearly avoiding any interaction. A moment later, another nurse entered, this one carrying fresh bandages. Like her colleague, she maintained a professional but distinctly distant attitude. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to check your wounds," the nurse announced, her voice clipped and formal. Carol smiled gently. "Of course, dear, whatever you need to do." Sandra watched every move as the nurse changed the bandages on Carol's forehead and shoulder. The care was technically adequate but lacking any warmth or compassion. The nurse's hands were efficient but impersonal, as if she were handling an object rather than a person. "The dressings look clean," the nurse stated flatly. "A doctor will be in later to assess your progress." She gathered her supplies and left without another word. "I don't like this," Sandra muttered, her training making her particularly sensitive to the staff's behavior. "They're treating you like you're a problem to be managed, not a patient who needs care." Carol reached for her niece's hand. "I understand your frustration, sweetheart. But sometimes people act from a place of fear. It doesn't make it right, but meeting coldness with anger won't heal anything." Sandra squeezed her aunt's hand, marveling at her capacity for understanding even in these circumstances. Outside the room, they could hear Dr. Miller's voice as he conducted rounds with his team, deliberately skipping Carol's room and moving to the next patient. A young orderly entered with Carol's breakfast tray, placing it on the side table without a word and quickly retreating. The food was properly prepared but had been delivered well after the other patients had received their meals. "This isn't right," Sandra said, checking her watch. "Your breakfast is almost an hour late." "Then I'm grateful it's here now," Carol replied calmly, though her fatigue was evident in her voice. "Sometimes, Sandra, the hardest thing to do is to show kindness when others can't. But that's often when it matters most." Sandra stood up, straightening her jacket. "Well, they may not want to show kindness, but they're going to show proper medical care. I'll make sure of that." Her badge caught the morning light as she moved to help her aunt with the breakfast tray, a quiet reminder of her authority in an increasingly tense situation. Sandra moved purposefully through the hospital corridors during her aunt's afternoon rest period. Her FBI training had taught her how to gather information discreetly, and she put those skills to good use now. In the hospital cafeteria, she spotted an older nurse eating lunch alone. Sandra purchased a coffee and approached with a friendly smile. "Mind if I join you?" The nurse, whose name tag read Margaret, gestured to the empty chair. "Please do." "I'm here with my aunt, Carol Johnson," Sandra mentioned casually, stirring her coffee. "She came in last night after a car accident." Margaret's expression shifted slightly. "Oh yes, I heard about that case." She glanced around before lowering her voice. "That shouldn't have happened, the way she was left waiting." Sandra leaned forward. "Has anything like this happened before?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Let's just say Dr. Miller has certain attitudes. 3 months ago, a Hispanic family filed a formal complaint after their father was made to wait hours for treatment. Last year, an Asian resident quit after repeated conflicts with him." Throughout the afternoon, Sandra gathered more pieces of the puzzle. A janitor mentioned overhearing Dr. Miller make dismissive comments about a Middle Eastern patient's concerns. A pharmacy technician recalled multiple instances where Miller had questioned black patients' pain levels more aggressively than others. In the physical therapy department, Sandra met James, a black physical therapist who had worked at the hospital for 15 years. His reaction to hearing about Carol's case was telling. "Unfortunately, I'm not surprised," James said, shaking his head. "I've seen it too many times. Dr. Miller has a way of prioritizing certain patients over others. The administration has received complaints, but nothing ever seems to change." A young resident speaking anonymously in a quiet corner of the library shared more. "During my first week here, I witnessed Dr. Miller dismiss a Latino patient's symptoms as probably just anxiety. The patient actually had early signs of a heart attack. Another doctor caught it just in time." Sandra's notebook filled with similar stories. A pattern emerged of subtle discrimination, dismissed complaints, and a culture of silence. Some staff members seemed afraid to speak up, while others had simply accepted it as an unfortunate reality. In the hospital records room, where Sandra's FBI credentials granted her access, she discovered multiple formal complaints filed against Dr. Miller over the past 5 years. Most had been quietly resolved or dismissed due to insufficient evidence. A senior nurse practitioner about to retire after 30 years at the hospital provided the most damning information. "Miller's father was killed during a robbery 20 years ago," she explained in hushed tones. "The perpetrator was a minority. Since then, he's carried this bias. We all see it, but he's well connected with the hospital board." As Sandra made her way back to Carol's room, she passed Dr. Miller in the hallway. He avoided eye contact, just as he had been doing since the previous night. But now, Sandra understood more about the man who had left her aunt waiting in that hallway. The evidence painted a clear picture of systemic issues that went far beyond one incident. Her phone buzzed with a text from a hospital administrator she'd spoken with earlier, confirming what others had suggested. There were at least 7 documented complaints about Dr. Miller's discriminatory behavior in the past year alone, all carefully buried in administrative red tape. Sandra found herself standing at the nurses' station, watching Dr. Miller interact with different patients through the glass walls of their rooms. The contrast in his behavior was subtle but unmistakable, warmer and more attentive with some, brusque and dismissive with others. The pattern was clear, and now she had the evidence to prove it. Sandra sat in her FBI office early the next morning, her desk illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. She had called in a few personal days to handle this situation properly, but she wasn't going to waste the resources at her disposal. "Thanks for rushing these files, Tom," she said to her colleague in records, who had just dropped off a thick folder. "I appreciate you pulling the hospital's inspection reports." The manila folder contained years of regulatory reviews, staff complaints, and patient satisfaction surveys. Sandra began methodically organizing the information, creating a detailed timeline of Dr. Miller's tenure at the hospital. Her phone buzzed, a message from her contact at the state medical board. "Got something interesting," it read. 3 formal investigations in the past decade, all sealed." Sandra's jaw tightened as she accessed the secure database. The sealed records painted a troubling picture. Complaints of differential treatment, delayed care, and dismissive behavior toward minority patients. Each investigation had been closed without action, often citing insufficient evidence or inconclusive findings. She pulled out her notepad and began connecting the dots. There were clear patterns in the timing and nature of the complaints. Several incidents coincided with holiday periods when the ER was busiest, just like what happened to Carol on Halloween night. "Agent Bennett?" Her assistant appeared at the door. "The hospital's HR director returned your call. She's willing to meet off the record." Sandra nodded, gathering her files. She had carefully built relationships with several hospital staff members over the past few days, and now those connections were paying off. The HR director had initially been hesitant but agreed to meet at a coffee shop away from the hospital. Before leaving, Sandra accessed one more database, the FBI's civil rights violation records. She cross-referenced similar cases nationwide, looking for precedents and patterns. The results were sobering. Hundreds of cases of medical discrimination, many unreported or unaddressed. In her car, Sandra called her supervisor. "Sir, I need to formally request an expansion of my investigation. I believe we're looking at potential civil rights violations spanning multiple years." "Proceed carefully, Bennett," he warned. "Medical institutions have powerful legal teams. Make sure your evidence is solid." Sandra arrived at the coffee shop early, selecting a quiet corner booth. She arranged her files carefully, not to overwhelm the HR director, but to demonstrate the thoroughness of her investigation. The HR director arrived looking nervous. "What you're suggesting about Dr. Miller? It's been an open secret for years," she admitted, stirring her untouched coffee. "But the hospital board, they're protective of him. His father's death affected him deeply, and they've always made excuses." Sandra took out her notebook. "I need specific instances, dates, names, patterns of behavior, anything you can share." For the next hour, the HR director spoke in hushed tones about incidents she had witnessed or heard about. Sandra's notes grew more detailed. A pattern of subtle discrimination, of delayed treatments, of dismissive attitudes toward certain patients' pain levels. Back at her office, Sandra began organizing the evidence into clear categories: documented incidents, witness statements, statistical patterns, and official complaints. She created a secure digital folder, backing up everything to the FBI servers. Her phone lit up with a text from one of the nurses she had interviewed. "Found more incident reports from the night shift. Can meet tomorrow." Sandra looked at the growing pile of evidence on her desk. What had started as a personal mission to address her aunt's mistreatment was evolving into something larger. The systematic nature of the discrimination was becoming clearer with each new piece of information she uncovered. She picked up her phone again, dialing a number she had been saving. "Civil Rights Division? This is Agent Bennett. I need to discuss opening a formal investigation." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Sandra and Jordan helped Carol up the walkway to her modest two-story home. Carol's steps were slow but steady, her hospital bag clutched in Jordan's free hand while Sandra supported her other side. "I can manage just fine," Carol insisted with a gentle smile, though she didn't refuse their help. Her shoulder was heavily bandaged beneath her loose-fitting blouse, and a small bandage still covered the healing cut on her forehead. Inside, Jordan settled his mother into her favorite armchair, the worn fabric comfortable and familiar. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, warming the space and highlighting the collection of family photos on the walls. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened," Jordan said, pulling up a chair beside her. At 32, he had his mother's kind eyes, but carried himself with the careful precision of someone who spent his days in courtrooms. Sandra's been gathering information about Dr. Miller and the hospital. Carol smoothed her skirt, her expression serene despite the serious tone in her son's voice. "The Lord teaches us to forgive, children. What's done is done." Sandra paced the room, her FBI badge still clipped to her belt. "Aunt Carol, this isn't about forgiveness. What happened to you? It's part of a pattern." She pulled out her tablet, showing Carol the carefully organized files. "Dr. Miller has a history of treating minority patients differently. There are dozens of complaints, investigations that were buried." 3 sealed investigations by the medical board, Jordan added, his legal training evident in his precise delivery. Multiple patient complaints about delayed treatment, dismissive behavior, and inadequate care, all following similar patterns. Carol's warm brown eyes studied both her son and niece. Despite their different approaches to justice, Sandra's fierce determination and Jordan's methodical legal mind, she saw the same protective love in both of them. "I understand you're both upset," Carol said, reaching out to take their hands, "but revenge won't heal what happened." "It's not about revenge, Mom," Jordan explained, squeezing her hand gently. "It's about preventing this from happening to someone else's mother, someone else's aunt, someone who might not have an FBI agent niece or a lawyer son to fight for them." Sandra knelt beside Carol's chair. "The hospital staff I've interviewed, they're afraid to speak up. But they've seen things, Aunt Carol. Dr. Miller's behavior has gone unchecked for years because people in power protected him." Carol looked at the family photos on her wall, generations of strength and resilience captured in frames. Her own mother had faced far worse in her time, yet never lost her capacity for compassion. "I hear what you're saying," Carol said softly, "and I know your hearts are in the right place. But promise me something. Whatever you do, let it come from a place of healing, not hatred. Let it be about making things better, not about making someone pay." Jordan and Sandra exchanged glances. They knew their mother and aunt well enough to recognize that this wasn't just passive acceptance. It was wisdom born from a lifetime of choosing grace over bitterness. "We promise," Sandra said, her voice softening. "I've already started coordinating with the Civil Rights Division. We're going to handle this properly through the right channels. And I'll be working with the medical board's legal team," Jordan added. "Everything by the book, Mom, but it needs to be addressed." Carol nodded, a gentle smile crossing her face. "Then I trust you both to do what's right." She squeezed their hands once more before releasing them. "Now, would anyone like some tea? I've been dreaming about my own kitchen since they served me that hospital breakfast." Sandra and Jordan sat at Carol's kitchen table, legal papers and documentation spread out before them, while their untouched coffee grew cold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden surface as they discussed their options. "The evidence is compelling," Jordan said, shuffling through the stack of complaints he'd gathered. "We have a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning years. The hospital's own records showed disparities in treatment times based on patient demographics." Sandra nodded, her FBI training evident in the precise way she'd organized her findings. "I've identified at least 7 staff members willing to testify about Dr. Miller's conduct, though they're scared of retaliation." Carol watched from her spot at the end of the table, her hands wrapped around her warm tea mug. The familiar scent of chamomile couldn't quite calm the unease in her heart. Children. These big hospitals have teams of lawyers. They have money and influence we can't match. "That's exactly why they need to be held accountable, Aunt Carol," Sandra insisted, her voice carrying the same determination she brought to her FBI cases. "They think their resources make them untouchable." Jordan pulled out another document, his lawyer's precision showing in every movement. "We can file for medical negligence based on the delayed treatment alone. The discrimination angle gives us additional grounds. The Civil Rights Division's involvement will make it harder for them to sweep this under the rug." Carol shifted in her chair, wincing slightly as her injured shoulder protested. "I just don't want you both investing so much time and energy into something that might not go anywhere. These big institutions, they protect their own." "That's what they want you to think, Mom," Jordan said gently. "But the law is on our side. We have documented evidence of your wait times compared to other patients that night. We have witness statements about Dr. Miller's behavior." Sandra reached across the table to take her aunt's hand. "We're not alone in this. My FBI connections and Jordan's legal expertise give us advantages they won't expect. Plus, there are advocacy groups ready to support cases like this." "The hospital's wealth might actually work in our favor," Jordan added, pulling out more papers. "They'll want to avoid negative publicity. A discrimination lawsuit could damage their reputation and affect their funding." Carol looked at the determined faces of her son and niece, seeing the strength of their convictions. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were David facing Goliath, without the divine intervention that had aided the biblical hero. "I trust you both," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "But promise me something. If this starts to look like it's hurting more than helping, if it begins to drain us of peace instead of bringing justice, and promise me we'll step back and reconsider." Sandra and Jordan exchanged glances, recognizing the wisdom in Carol's words even as their own determination remained unshaken. "We promise, Mom," Jordan said, reaching for her other hand. "But we also promise to fight this the right way, with every legal tool at our disposal." "The truth is on our side," Sandra added, her FBI badge glinting on her belt as she shifted in her chair. "Sometimes that's more powerful than all the money and influence in the world." Carol nodded slowly, looking at the scattered papers that represented their case against the hospital. Part of her still wondered if there wasn't a gentler path to change, but she understood her children's need to fight this battle. Perhaps this was how justice and mercy would find their balance, through the determined efforts of those who loved her, tempered by her own prayers for wisdom and healing. Carol sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her Bible resting in her lap as the morning light filtered through the curtains. Her shoulder still ached, a constant reminder of that Halloween night. But it was her heart that felt the heaviest burden. She could hear Sandra in the next room, her voice carrying through the walls as she spoke on the phone with Jordan about the lawsuit they'd just filed. Their anger, though coming from a place of love, didn't sit right with Carol's spirit. "Lord, help me understand," she whispered, running her fingers along the worn pages of her Bible. The familiar texture brought comfort, as it had through so many difficult times before. Her mind drifted to Dr. Miller's face. Not the cold mask he'd worn that night, but the flicker of something else she'd caught in his eyes. Was it fear? Pain? Something deeper? Through the window, Carol watched a family walking their dog, the parents holding hands while their child skipped ahead. It reminded her of what her pastor always said. "Everyone has a story we know nothing about." Sandra's voice grew louder as she paced into the living room. "The paperwork's been filed, Aunt Carol. Jordan says we should hear something within a few days." Her niece's face glowed with determination, but Carol noticed the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of too many late nights spent building their case. "Thank you, sweetheart," Carol said softly. "You've worked so hard for me." "Of course I have. What he did was wrong, Aunt Carol. He needs to face consequences." Carol nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the cross pendant at her neck. "I keep thinking about him, Sandra. Not about what he did, but about why." Sandra's expression tightened. "It doesn't matter why. Discrimination is discrimination." "Maybe it does matter, though," Carol said, her voice gentle but firm. "In all my years teaching Sunday school, I've learned that hurt people hurt people. There's usually more to the story." The FBI agent in Sandra wanted to argue. Carol could see it in the way her niece's jaw clenched. But instead, she sat down on the couch nearby. "The case has been filed. We can't turn back now." "I know, dear. And maybe that's part of God's plan, too." Carol shifted in her chair, wincing slightly at the pull in her shoulder. "But while you and Jordan fight this battle in the courts, I feel called to fight it another way." "What do you mean?" Carol smiled, remembering all the times her faith had led her down unexpected paths. "I'm not sure yet, but I know that beneath Dr. Miller's actions, there's a person who needs healing just as much as I did that night." Sandra leaned forward, concern etched on her face. "Aunt Carol, please don't tell me you're thinking of forgiving him." "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook, Sandra. It's about freeing yourself to see the bigger picture." Carol reached for her niece's hand. "You and Jordan are fighting for justice, and that's important. But something in my spirit tells me there's more to this story than we know." Through the window, the sound of children laughing drifted in from the street. Carol watched as Sandra struggled with her words, torn between her protective instincts and her respect for her aunt's faith. "I don't understand how you can be so calm about this," Sandra finally said, squeezing Carol's hand. "I'm not calm, sweetheart. I'm faithful. There's a difference." Carol looked down at her Bible, then back at her niece. "Sometimes the hardest part of faith is trusting that God's plan might look very different from our own." Sandra's phone buzzed with another call from Jordan, probably with more updates about the case. As her niece stepped away to answer it, Carol returned her gaze to the window, her heart heavy with both concern and hope. Something told her that this situation needed more than just legal action. It needed understanding, compassion, and perhaps even grace. The morning sun cast long shadows across Carol's front yard when an unfamiliar silver sedan pulled up to her driveway. Through the living room window, Carol watched as a well-dressed woman emerged, her shoulders tense and her steps hesitant as she approached the front door. The doorbell chimed and Carol slowly made her way to answer it, her injuries still making movement a careful process. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a woman whose elegant appearance couldn't hide the worry etched across her features. "Mrs. Johnson?" the woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Elizabeth Miller, Dr. Miller's wife." Carol's breath caught for a moment, but her expression remained gentle. "Would you like to come in?" Elizabeth nodded gratefully, following Carol into the living room. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as they sat down. "I found the court summons this morning," Elizabeth began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, Dr. Miller, doesn't know I'm here, but I had to come. I had to try to explain." Carol settled into her armchair, noting how Elizabeth's eyes lingered on her bandaged shoulder. "You've come a long way to talk to me, Mrs. Miller. Please call me Elizabeth." She took a deep breath. "What happened that night, it wasn't right. I know that. Thomas knows that too now. He hasn't been sleeping. He barely eats. The guilt is eating him alive." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as she continued. 20 years ago, Thomas's father was attacked and killed in a robbery gone wrong. He was a doctor, too, working late at his clinic in a rough neighborhood. Thomas was just starting medical school then. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The perpetrators were never caught, and Thomas, he let that pain twist into something ugly, something he never dealt with properly. Carol listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "It doesn't excuse what he did," Elizabeth hurried to add. "Nothing could excuse that. But Thomas is a good doctor, Mrs. Johnson. He's saved countless lives over the years. He let his past trauma blind him, make him see threats where there weren't any." Elizabeth reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. This was Thomas with his father at his medical school acceptance ceremony. They were so close. After losing him, Thomas built walls around himself. But what happened with you? It's finally forced him to see what those walls have turned him into. Carol took the photograph gently, studying the young, smiling face of Dr. Miller standing proudly next to an older man with kind eyes. "He's been different since that night," Elizabeth continued, her voice breaking. "I've never seen him like this. He keeps saying he doesn't deserve to be a doctor anymore, that he betrayed everything his father taught him about healing and caring for others." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "I'm not asking you to drop the lawsuit. You have every right to seek justice. I needed you to know that the man who treated you so terribly that night, that's not who my husband really is. He's lost his way, but seeing what his biases made him do to you, it's shattered something inside him." Carol set the photograph down carefully on the coffee table between them. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Elizabeth. It couldn't have been easy to come here." "I know it's a lot to ask," Elizabeth said softly. "But is there any way you might consider talking with him? Let him apologize in person? He needs to face what he's done, and maybe it could help both of you heal." Carol sat quietly for a long moment, her hand still resting on the photograph. Elizabeth's visit had stirred something in her heart, but the situation wasn't simple. Sandra paced the living room, her FBI badge glinting on her belt as she moved, while Jordan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Aunt Carol," Sandra said, her voice tight with concern. "This doesn't change the fact that he's done this before. We found multiple complaints spanning years. What about those other families?" Carol looked up at her niece with gentle eyes. "I hear you, Sandra, but people can change when they're truly ready." Jordan pushed himself off the wall, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "The evidence we've gathered is solid. His pattern of behavior shows a clear bias in treatment. This isn't just about one mistake." "You're right," Carol agreed, surprising them both. "It's about many mistakes, many wounds, both the ones he caused and the ones he carries." She picked up the photograph again, studying it carefully. "Look at this young man here, full of hope and dreams of helping people just like his father." Sandra stopped pacing, her frustration visible. "But that's not who he is now. As an FBI agent, I've seen too many people use their past trauma to justify hurting others. We have a responsibility to protect future patients." "I understand that duty, Sandra," Carol said softly. "But I also understand the power of forgiveness. Not just for the person being forgiven, but for the one doing the forgiving." Jordan moved closer, sitting on the arm of his mother's chair. "Mom, we're worried about you taking this too lightly. This man nearly cost you your life." Carol reached for her son's hand. "I'm not taking it lightly, Jordan. I'm taking it seriously, very seriously. Serious enough to consider that maybe this is about more than punishment." Sandra threw up her hands in exasperation. "But Aunt Carol, His wife's story doesn't erase what he did. He's had 20 years to deal with his father's death. Instead, he chose to let it poison his practice of medicine. You're right again, Carol nodded. He did choose that. And now he has another choice to make. We all do. Jordan and Sandra exchanged worried looks. Carol continued, Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Dr. Miller needs to face what he's done, yes, but he also needs to see that change is possible. The lawsuit could force the hospital to implement better oversight, Sandra argued. It could prevent discrimination against other patients. Carol smiled gently. And what if there was another way to achieve that? What if Dr. Miller himself could become an advocate for change? Sandra shook her head, unconvinced. That's a big what if, Aunt Carol. We have real evidence of harm right now. I know this is hard for both of you, Carol said, looking between her niece and son. Your anger comes from love. Love for me and for justice. But I'm asking you to consider that true justice might look different than what we first imagined. The room fell quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. Sandra's hand rested unconsciously on her badge, while Jordan's legal papers lay forgotten on the coffee table. The weight of the decision hung in the air between them. Carol picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Sandra and Jordan watched in tense silence as she dialed Elizabeth's number, which had been left during yesterday's visit. Elizabeth? This is Carol Johnson, she said softly. I've been thinking about our conversation. Would your husband be willing to come to my home tomorrow afternoon? Sandra's eyes widened, and Jordan straightened in his chair. Carol held up a gentle hand to quiet their protests as she listened to Elizabeth's response. Yes, 3 o'clock would be fine. And Elizabeth, thank you for coming yesterday. It meant a lot. After hanging up, Carol turned to face her family. Dr. Miller agreed to come tomorrow. I want both of you here too. Mom, are you sure about this? Jordan's legal papers rustled as he shifted uncomfortably. I am, Carol replied firmly. We need to look into his eyes and hear his story. Not just the facts in those files, but the truth in his heart. Sandra crossed her arms, her FBI badge catching the afternoon light. I don't like it, Aunt Carol, but I'll be here. Someone needs to watch out for you. The next day, precisely at 3 o'clock, a knock echoed through Carol's modest home. Jordan opened the door to find Dr. Miller standing there, looking smaller somehow than he had in the hospital. His shoulders were hunched, his usual confident demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. Please come in, Carol called from her favorite armchair. Sandra stood protectively nearby, while Jordan gestured the doctor toward an empty seat. Dr. Miller sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room felt heavy with unspoken words and raw emotions. Dr. Miller, Carol began, her voice gentle but firm. I wanted to meet with you because I believe in second chances. Your wife shared some of your story with me, but I'd like to hear it from you. The doctor's eyes darted between Sandra's stern expression and Jordan's carefully neutral face before settling on Carol. I don't deserve this opportunity, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe not, Sandra interjected sharply, but Carol raised her hand again. Let him speak, Sandra. Dr. Miller took a shaky breath. My father was a doctor, too. He worked in the inner city, dedicated his life to helping others. One night, he was killed during a robbery at his clinic. I was 17. He paused, his hands trembling. I let that pain twist something inside me. Instead of honoring his memory by carrying on his work, I betrayed everything he stood for. Carol leaned forward slightly. And now? Now? Dr. Miller's voice cracked. Now I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror. What I did to you, what I've done to others, it's unforgivable. I've become everything my father fought against. Jordan shifted in his seat, his legal training warring with the raw humanity of the moment. Sandra remained rigid, but her expression had softened almost imperceptibly. The night of my accident, Carol said quietly, I was coming from a church meeting where we'd been discussing forgiveness. Not the easy kind that comes when someone accidentally steps on your toe, but the hard kind. The kind that changes lives. Dr. Miller looked up, his eyes glistening. "Mrs. Johnson, I don't know how to make this right." "That's why I asked you here," Carol replied. "Because making it right starts with facing the truth. Not just about what happened that night, but about all of it." The doorbell chimed at precisely 3 o'clock the next afternoon. Carol sat in her favorite armchair, a warm throw blanket draped across her lap despite the mild temperature. Sandra stood near the window, her arms crossed, while Jordan positioned himself closer to the door. When Jordan opened it, Dr. Miller stood on the porch looking markedly different from his usual composed hospital demeanor. His tie was slightly crooked, and he clutched a bouquet of pink and white roses so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights, and his typically neat hair showed signs of anxious finger-combing. "Please come in," Carol called out warmly, her voice carrying the same gentleness she used when teaching Sunday school. Dr. Miller stepped inside, his shoes making soft sounds against the hardwood floor. He glanced nervously between Sandra's stern expression and Jordan's carefully neutral face before his eyes settled on Carol. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These are for you." He extended the bouquet with slightly trembling hands. Sandra moved forward to take the flowers, her FBI training evident in her cautious approach. She placed them on the coffee table, positioning herself between her aunt and the doctor. "Thank you, they're lovely," Carol said, gesturing to an empty chair across from her. "Please have a seat." Dr. Miller lowered himself into the chair, perching on its edge as if ready to flee at any moment. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the family photos on the walls and the well-worn Bible on the side table. How are you feeling?" he asked, clearing his throat. "Your injuries, are they healing properly?" Carol touched the small bandage still on her forehead. "Much better, thank you. Dr. Alvarez did an excellent job with the stitches." At the mention of his colleague's name, Dr. Miller's face flushed with shame. He clasped and unclasped his hands in his lap, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his usual confident hospital persona. "I'm glad to hear that," he said softly. "Mrs. Johnson, before I say anything else, I need you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night. A lot of soul-searching, you might say." Jordan shifted in his position near the doorway, his legal pad tucked under one arm. Sandra remained standing, her posture alert but less rigid than before. Dr. Miller took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort. "I suppose I should start at the beginning," he said, his voice growing steadier. "It's not an excuse for my actions. Nothing could excuse what I did. But I think you deserve to know why I became the person I am today." He paused, looking down at his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a mix of pain and determination. "My father was also a doctor," he began, his voice catching slightly on the word father. "He had a small clinic in—" Dr. Miller's voice grew softer as he delved into his past. "My father ran a small clinic in East Oakland," he said, his fingers absently tracing the seam of his pants. "He believed in serving everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. We didn't live wealthy, but he was proud of what he did." Carol noticed how his shoulders tensed as he continued. The afternoon light streaming through the window cast shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of stress around his eyes. "I was 15 when it happened," he said, swallowing hard. "Dad was working late one night, as usual. There had been a shooting in the neighborhood, and he was treating victims." Dr. Miller's voice cracked slightly. "A man came in demanding drugs. When Dad refused—" He stopped, taking a shaky breath. Sandra's professional demeanor softened slightly as she watched the doctor struggle with his words. Even Jordan uncrossed his arms, his legal pad forgotten at his side. "The man shot him," Dr. Miller continued, his words coming out in a rush. "Right there in the clinic. They never caught who did it. All we knew was that he was black, from witness descriptions." He looked up at Carol, his eyes glistening. "I was supposed to help at the clinic that night, but I'd gone to a friend's house instead. I've carried that guilt for decades." The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock, Carol's hands folded in her lap, her expression compassionate but reserved. After that, Dr. Miller's voice wavered. I let anger take root. I knew it was wrong. My father would have been ashamed of me. He taught me that everyone deserves care and respect. But I couldn't shake this fear, this anger. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. It turned into something ugly inside me, something that made me treat people differently, even though I swore an oath to help everyone. He looked directly at Carol, his face etched with shame. What I did to you that night, making you wait when you needed immediate care, it was inexcusable. I've done it before, too many times to count. I've tried to justify it, tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it wasn't happening. But seeing you there, seeing your niece's fury and knowing how right she was, he shook his head slowly. It forced me to face what I've become. Jordan shifted uncomfortably against the wall, while Sandra remained silent, her trained eyes studying Dr. Miller's every movement. I know this doesn't make it right, Dr. Miller said, his voice steadying. Nothing can make it right. My father's death was a tragedy, but I've been perpetuating more tragedy through my own actions. I've dishonored his memory and everything he stood for. He paused, drawing a deep breath. I've been seeing a therapist since that night, trying to finally address these biases I've carried for so long. I know it's just a start, but I need to change. I have to change. Dr. Miller's hands trembled as he clasped them together, his knuckles turning white. I've already drafted my resignation letter, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hospital board will receive it tomorrow morning. I can't. He paused, drawing in a shaky breath. I can't continue practicing medicine when I've violated its most basic principles. Carol shifted forward in her armchair, her eyes soft with understanding. The afternoon sunlight caught the silver threads in her hair as she studied the broken man before her. After what happened to you, after all the other patients I've mistreated, Dr. Miller's voice cracked. I don't deserve to wear this white coat anymore. I've let my bitterness poison everything I worked for. Sandra stood rigid by the window, her FBI training evident in her controlled posture, while Jordan leaned against the wall, his legal pad now forgotten in his lap. The room felt heavy with unspoken emotions. Carol smoothed her dress and cleared her throat softly. Dr. Miller, she began, her voice warm and steady. Thank you for having the courage to come here today. Not many would face their mistakes so honestly. Dr. Miller looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You know, Carol continued, every Sunday at church we talk about forgiveness. But it's not just words to me. It's how I've learned to live. She adjusted the cushion behind her back, wincing slightly from her healing injuries. When that car hit me on Halloween night, I could have let anger take over, but that would have only hurt me more. Sandra shifted uncomfortably, her protective instincts clearly wrestling with her aunt's words. Jordan's pen tapped quietly against his notepad. What happened to your father was terrible, Carol said gently. No child should lose a parent that way. But holding on to that pain has only created more hurt, for you and for others. She paused, letting her words sink in. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't walking away. It's staying and doing the hard work of changing. Dr. Miller's shoulders slumped as he absorbed her words. Tears gathered in the corners of his eyes. The world doesn't need fewer doctors who recognize their mistakes, Carol continued, her voice firm but kind. It needs more who are willing to learn from them. Resigning won't heal the past, but staying and becoming better might help build a better future. Sandra's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Jordan had stopped taking notes entirely, his attention fixed on his mother's words. I believe in second chances, Carol said, folding her hands in her lap. Not because people deserve them, but because that's how we all grow. That's how we heal, both ourselves and others. Dr. Miller wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. After everything I did, how can you be so forgiving? Because holding on to bitterness only hurts the person carrying it, Carol replied softly. I've seen what it did to you. I don't want that for myself or for my family. She glanced meaningfully at Sandra and Jordan. Sandra's stern expression began to waver as she watched her aunt's gentle interaction with Dr. Miller. The FBI agent's trained eyes, usually so quick to spot deception, could see only raw honesty in the doctor's trembling hands and tear-streaked face. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the hard edge of her anger slowly beginning to soften. Jordan set his legal pad aside, his lawyer's mind processing the scene before him in a new light. He had come ready for confrontation, armed with case precedents and legal strategies. But watching his mother's quiet strength and Dr. Miller's genuine remorse made him question whether the courtroom was really the best place to resolve this. "Mom always did see things differently than most people," Jordan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Sandra glanced at her cousin, recognizing the familiar tone he used when reconsidering a position. Dr. Miller pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing at his eyes. His shoulders, which had been hunched with shame throughout the conversation, gradually relaxed as Carol's words of forgiveness settled over him. The change wasn't lost on Sandra, who had interrogated enough suspects to know the difference between performed and genuine emotion. "I've spent so many years being angry," Sandra admitted, her voice softer than before. "Always fighting for justice, always ready to take down the bad guys." She moved away from the window, taking a few steps closer to where Dr. Miller sat. "But maybe sometimes justice looks different than what we expect." Jordan nodded, running a hand through his hair. "When I first heard what happened, all I could think about was filing charges, building a case." He looked at his mother with newfound appreciation. "But Mom's right. Sometimes the harder path is staying to make things right." The afternoon light cast long shadows across the living room as they sat in thoughtful silence. The bouquet Dr. Miller had brought earlier filled the room with a subtle fragrance, a reminder of his initial gesture of peace. "Dr. Miller," Sandra said, her professional demeanor giving way to something more personal, "what happened to my aunt was wrong, but I can see now that you understand that better than anyone." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "And I can see that you're truly sorry." Jordan reached for his legal pad again, but this time he didn't write notes for a lawsuit. Instead, he began jotting down ideas for how the hospital could improve its practices. "Maybe," he suggested, looking up at Dr. Miller, "we could work together on implementing better training programs. Turn this into something positive." Dr. Miller looked from Sandra to Jordan with disbelief, as if he couldn't quite trust this shift in their attitudes. I don't know what to say," he managed. "I came here expecting your anger. I deserved your anger." "You did," Sandra agreed frankly. "But Aunt Carol's right. Holding on to that anger won't help anyone. Not us, not you, and definitely not future patients who could benefit from a doctor who's learned from his mistakes." The tension that had filled the room earlier continued to dissolve, as both Sandra and Jordan recognized the possibility of transformation that stood before them. Their aunt's wisdom had shown them a path forward that promised more healing than any legal victory could provide. Carol leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped together as she considered her next words carefully. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to hear what she would say. "Dr. Miller," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe you're sincere about wanting to make things right, but words need to be followed by actions." Dr. Miller nodded, wiping his eyes with the handkerchief again. "I understand completely. That's why I've decided to resign." "Yes," Carol said, "but resigning alone isn't enough. Running away won't heal the hurt you've caused." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "What if you used your skills to help the very communities you've shown bias against?" Sandra and Jordan exchanged glances, surprised by their aunt's suggestion. Dr. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly as he processed her words. "There are so many underserved neighborhoods that desperately need good doctors," Carol continued. "Places where people can't afford proper medical care, where they're treated as less than human simply because of their circumstances." Dr. Miller's hand stopped trembling as understanding dawned on his face. "You mean working in community clinics?" "Exactly," Carol replied. "Instead of hiding from your mistakes, you could face them head-on by serving those you've wronged. Show through your actions that you're truly committed to change. If you do this," Sandra added, warming to her aunt's idea, And if you're genuinely dedicated to making amends, we won't pursue legal action." Dr. Miller sat up straighter, his expression shifting from shame to determination. I think that's more than fair. It's actually exactly what I need to do." He took a deep breath. "I vow to dedicate myself to helping these communities, to treating every patient with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their background." "It won't be easy," Jordan warned. "You'll be facing your prejudices every single day." "I know," Dr. Miller replied, his voice stronger now. "But that's precisely why I need to do it. How can I ever truly change if I don't confront these biases head-on?" Carol smiled warmly, reaching out to pat Dr. Miller's hand. "Sometimes the hardest path is the one that leads to the most growth. You'll be helping others while helping yourself." Dr. Miller stood up, squaring his shoulders with newfound purpose. "I'll submit my resignation first thing tomorrow morning, and I'll start looking into community clinics that need doctors." He turned to Carol. "Thank you for showing me a way forward, a way to make real amends." Dr. Miller stood at the doorway, his eyes glistening with tears. He turned back to face Carol, Sandra, and Jordan, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't thank you enough for giving me this chance. Most people would have thrown the book at me, and I would have deserved it." Carol smiled warmly from her seat. "Sometimes the hardest thing is to show kindness when others expect vengeance." "I promise you," Dr. Miller said, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, "I won't let your faith in me go to waste. Every patient I treat from now on will get the care and respect they deserve. The care I should have given you, Mrs. Johnson." Sandra stepped forward, her earlier hostility softened but still cautious. "We'll be watching to make sure you keep that promise, Dr. Miller." He nodded earnestly. "I would expect nothing less, and I welcome it. Having people hold me accountable, it's exactly what I need." After Dr. Miller left, the family sat in thoughtful silence. Jordan was the first to speak. "Aunt Carol, I have to admit, when you first suggested giving him a second chance, I thought you were being too soft." "Me too," Sandra added, settling onto the couch beside Carol. "But watching him today, seeing how your forgiveness affected him, it was powerful." Carol reached out and took both their hands in hers. "Hatred only breeds more hatred. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is break that cycle." She squeezed their hands gently. "Dr. Miller made terrible mistakes, but he's willing to change. That willingness is precious and rare." "It's amazing," Jordan mused, shaking his head. "You turned what could have been a bitter legal battle into something healing for everyone involved." Sandra leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know what strikes me most? When we came in today, we were all so angry, so ready for a fight. But you showed us there was another way. A better way." "That's the thing about forgiveness," Carol said softly. "It doesn't just free the person being forgiven, it frees us too." Carol sat in her favorite armchair by the window, sunlight streaming across her lap as she opened the envelope with Dr. Miller's return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, the careful penmanship reflecting thoughtful consideration of each word. Her eyes moved across the pages as Dr. Miller described his first week at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital. He wrote about the initial awkwardness and uncertainty he felt, and how some staff members had been understandably wary of him given his history. "Every day presents new challenges," he wrote, "but also new opportunities for growth. Yesterday, I treated an elderly black woman who reminded me so much of you, Mrs. Johnson. She had the same gentle spirit, the same quiet dignity. For the first time in my career, I truly saw her, not through the lens of my prejudices, but as a human being deserving of care and respect." Carol paused, touching the paper gently where a slight smudge suggested a tear had fallen as he wrote. The letter continued. "The hospital is understaffed and overworked, but the dedication of the medical team here is inspiring. They do so much with so little. I'm learning something new every day, not just about medicine, but about community, about resilience, and about my own biases that I'm finally confronting head-on." Dr. Miller described a young resident who had taken him under her wing, showing him the unique challenges faced by the community. "Dr. Washington has become both my mentor and my conscience," he wrote. "She doesn't let me hide from uncomfortable truths, but she also acknowledges every step of progress I make, no matter how small." Carol smiled as she read about his involvement in the hospital's community outreach program. He had volunteered to give free health screenings at local churches and community centers, places where many residents had historically been hesitant to seek medical care due to past experiences with discrimination. "The work is hard," his letter continued, "and sometimes the weight of my past mistakes feels overwhelming. But then I remember your forgiveness, Mrs. Johnson, and it gives me strength to keep pushing forward. Your compassion didn't just change my career path, it's changing my heart." He concluded by sharing a particular moment that had moved him deeply. "Last week, a young black man came in with his injured son. I could see the distrust in his eyes when he first saw me, but instead of retreating into defensiveness as I would have before, I remembered our conversation. I took extra time to listen, to explain everything clearly, to show them both that they mattered. By the end of the visit, the father shook my hand and thanked me. It was a small moment, but it meant everything." Carol held the letter close to her chest for a moment, feeling grateful tears well up in her eyes. The doorbell rang, and she carefully folded the letter back into its envelope as Sandra walked in for their daily visit. "What's that?" Sandra asked, noticing the envelope in her aunt's hands. "A letter from Dr. Miller," Carol replied, passing it to her niece. "He's doing good work, Sandra. Real, meaningful work." Sandra sat down to read the letter, her expression softening as she made her way through the pages. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted, "but it seems like your faith in him was well placed, Aunt Carol." Carol nodded, looking out at the autumn leaves dancing in the breeze. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe in their better nature," she said softly. "It gives them the courage to believe in themselves." Dr. Miller moved through the crowded shelter, carrying boxes of medical supplies for the weekly health screening program. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor as volunteers set up folding tables and chairs. He'd been volunteering here every Thursday for the past month, slowly earning the trust of the shelter's regular visitors. As he arranged blood pressure cuffs and stethoscopes on one of the tables, movement near the entrance caught his eye. A man in his 60s, wearing a threadbare jacket, shuffled in with the latest group seeking shelter from the cold. Something about him made Dr. Miller pause. There was a nagging familiarity in the man's weathered face and the way he kept his head slightly bowed. "Randall Turner," one of the shelter workers called out, checking names off a list. The man raised his hand quietly. Dr. Miller felt an odd sensation in his chest, like a half-remembered dream trying to surface. He knew that face from somewhere, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. He started to walk toward Randall, intent on introducing himself, when urgent calls from the screening area pulled his attention away. "Dr. Miller, we need you here. Mrs. Washington's blood pressure is concerning," called one of the nurses. For the next 3 hours, Dr. Miller found himself caught in a steady stream of patients requiring attention. Every so often, he'd glance toward the dining area where he'd last seen Randall, but the man seemed to have disappeared into the crowd of shelter residents. By the time his shift ended, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and quiet roads. Sitting in his kitchen later that night, nursing a cup of tea, Dr. Miller tried to place Randall's face in his memory. There was something there, something important, but it remained just beyond his grasp, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He rubbed his temples, frustrated by the mental block. The man's features were familiar, the deep-set eyes, the slight stoop of his shoulders, but the context eluded him completely. After several minutes of fruitless concentration, Dr. Miller gave up, though the nagging sensation of recognition continued to hover at the edges of his mind. The next morning, Dr. Miller arrived at the shelter just as the sun was beginning to peek over the city skyline. The early hour meant fewer people were around, making it easier to spot Randall sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee. Dr. Miller's footsteps echoed in the quiet space as he approached. Randall looked up, his weathered hands wrapped around the steaming cup. The familiar feeling of recognition tugged at Dr. Miller again, stronger than before. "Good morning," Dr. Miller said, keeping his voice gentle. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Randall gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Help yourself, Doc." Dr. Miller settled into the metal folding chair. "I noticed you yesterday. Have you been in the area long?" "Couple weeks," Randall replied, his eyes studying Dr. Miller's face. "Never seen a doctor make special trips to talk to shelter folks before sunrise." "Something about you seems familiar," Dr. Miller admitted. "I was wondering where you're from originally." Randall's expression shifted slightly, a mix of wariness and resignation crossing his features. He took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. "Been lots of places. Started out in Oak Ridge, moved around after my wife passed." Dr. Miller leaned forward slightly. "Oak Ridge? That's where I grew up." "Small world," Randall murmured. He set his coffee cup down and looked directly at Dr. Miller. "You really want to know how I ended up here, Doc?" The intensity in Randall's gaze made Dr. Miller pause. "Yes, I would." Randall glanced around the nearly empty room, then pulled his chair closer to the table. "It's not a pretty story, but if you've got the time to listen, I'll tell you." Dr. Miller nodded, settling back in his chair as Randall cleared his throat to begin his story. Randall's weathered hands tightened around his coffee cup as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, I was working 2 jobs, barely making ends meet. My wife, Sarah, she got sick. Cancer. The bills started piling up faster than I could handle. He paused, taking a shaky breath. Dr. Miller remained silent, watching as Randall's eyes grew distant with painful memories. "One night I got desperate. Real desperate. Sarah needed this experimental treatment and insurance wouldn't cover it. Randall's voice cracked. "I decided to rob someone. Just to threaten them, you know? Get enough money for 1 round of treatment." Dr. Miller felt his chest tighten as Randall continued. "Found this man leaving his office late at night. He was well-dressed, looked like he had money. I just wanted to scare him with an old gun I had. But he fought back, tried to grab the gun. Randall's hands were trembling now. The gun went off. I didn't mean for it to happen. 1 minute he was standing there, the next..." Tears welled up in Randall's eyes. "I panicked, ran away. Never got caught, but it didn't matter. Sarah died 3 months later anyway. The guilt's been eating at me ever since. Been moving from place to place, can't settle anywhere. Don't deserve to." Dr. Miller sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding. The pieces were falling into place. The location, the timing, the circumstances. Could this be the man who... "The worst part?" Randall continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I took a man's life, and it didn't even save my Sarah. Sometimes I think about turning myself in, but I'm too much of a coward. So I just drift, trying to do some good where I can, working at shelters, helping others. Not that it makes up for what I did." The morning light streaming through the shelter's windows cast long shadows across their table. Dr. Miller gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white, as he listened to Randall's confession. The weight of this moment, the raw honesty in Randall's voice, filled the space between them. "Every day I think about that man's family," Randall said softly. "Wonder about the pain I caused them, the lives I destroyed with one terrible mistake. Been carrying that burden for 2 decades now." Dr. Miller's hands trembled as Randall's story echoed in his mind. The details were hauntingly familiar. The late-night office, the desperate man with a gun, the struggle. His throat felt dry as he pulled out his wallet with shaking fingers. "This man," Dr. Miller said, his voice barely steady. "Was this the office building on Cedar Street, near the old pharmacy?" Randall's eyes widened. "How did you..." Dr. Miller extracted a worn photograph from his wallet and placed it on the table between them. The image showed a younger man in a doctor's coat, smiling broadly at the camera. "Was this him?" Randall stared at the photo, his face draining of color. His hands began to shake violently, causing his coffee cup to clatter against the table. Tears welled up in his eyes as recognition dawned on his face. "Oh, God," Randall whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh, God, no." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Dr. Miller sat there, a storm of emotions churning inside him. 20 years of anger, grief, and confusion crashed together in this moment. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving almost automatically as he dialed Sandra's number. "Sandra?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I need you to come to the Hope Community Shelter. Right now, I found him. The man who killed my father." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes, please come quickly." Randall hadn't moved, still crying into his hands. Other shelter residents glanced curiously in their direction, but kept their distance, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I never knew," Randall choked out between sobs. "I never knew he had a family. I mean, I assumed. But seeing your face, that picture. You're his son. You're his son. And I took him from you." Dr. Miller sat in silence, watching the broken man before him. The hatred he'd carried for so long felt different now, faced with the reality of his father's killer. Not a heartless criminal, but a desperate man destroyed by his own actions. Within 15 minutes, Sandra burst through the shelter doors, her FBI badge visible on her belt. She quickly spotted Dr. Miller and rushed over, her eyes darting between him and the weeping man at the table. "Is this him?" she asked quietly, her hand instinctively moving toward her badge. Dr. Miller nodded slowly. "He just confessed everything. All the details match. The location, the time, how it happened. He didn't know who my father was until now." Sandra pulled up a chair, her training kicking in as she assessed the situation. The revelation hung heavy in the air between the three of them. A moment 2 decades in the making, connecting their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. Sandra leaned forward in her chair, her eyes moving between Dr. Miller and Randall. The morning light filtering through the shelter's windows cast long shadows across their faces. "Dr. Miller," she said softly, "what would you like to do about this situation?" Randall's weathered hands clutched at the edge of the table. "Please, you have to understand," he pleaded, his voice rough with emotion. "I was desperate. My wife was dying, and we had nothing left. I never meant to kill anyone, I just wanted to scare him to get enough money for her treatment." Tears streamed down his lined face. "Not a day goes by that I don't hate myself for what happened." Dr. Miller sat quietly for a long moment, studying the broken man before him. The anger that had fueled him for so many years felt different now, transformed by his recent experiences working in the community. He thought of Carol's forgiveness, how it had changed him, how it had given him a second chance at being the doctor he was meant to be. "I forgive you," Dr. Miller said quietly, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. "What you did was terrible, and it destroyed my family. But I understand now that hatred only breeds more hatred. These past months working here, I've learned that people can change, that everyone deserves a second chance." Sandra's eyes widened at his words. She shook her head slowly, amazed at the transformation in the man who had once let his prejudices cloud his medical judgment. "Dr. Miller," she said carefully, "I'm impressed by how much you've changed. Your capacity for forgiveness is remarkable." She paused, straightening her shoulders. "However, I have an obligation to the law. This is a confession to a homicide, even if it was unintentional. As an FBI agent, I'm required to report this." Randall nodded resignedly, his shoulders slumping. "I understand," he whispered. "I've lived with this guilt for so long. Maybe it's time to face what I did." Dr. Miller reached across the table and placed a hand on Randall's arm. "I'll speak at your hearing," he said. "I'll tell them about your remorse, about how this has affected both our lives. We'll make sure they understand the full story." Sandra led Randall toward her car, her hand gently guiding his elbow. Before they left, she turned back to Dr. Miller, who stood watching them from the shelter's entrance. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine respect. "What you did in there, choosing forgiveness over vengeance, it shows real growth." Dr. Miller nodded, his eyes reflecting both pain and peace. "Carol taught me that," he replied softly. "Sometimes the hardest path is the right one." Several days passed. Dr. Miller continued his work at the community hospital, throwing himself into caring for patients with renewed dedication. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to prove that his transformation was real and lasting. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, as he finished updating patient charts, his phone buzzed. Sandra's name flashed across the screen. "Dr. Miller," she began when he answered, "I wanted to update you about Randall's case. He's been convicted based on his confession, but given the circumstances and the time that's passed, we have some flexibility here." She paused briefly. "As the victim's immediate family member, you have significant influence over how we proceed. If you want to pursue full charges, he could face considerable jail time." Dr. Miller leaned back in his chair, looking out his office window at the busy street below. Children played on the sidewalk while their parents chatted nearby. The scene reminded him of his own childhood, before tragedy had hardened his heart. "No," he said firmly. "I meant what I said about forgiveness. Putting him in jail won't bring my father back, and it won't help anyone heal." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I want to move forward, Sandra. Let's handle this with as much compassion as possible." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Sandra spoke again, her voice was warm with approval. "You know, when I first met you in that hospital, I never would have imagined saying this, but I'm proud of you, Dr. Miller. Your kindness now, after everything, it's remarkable." "Thank you, Sandra," he replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "But I'm just trying to live up to the example Carol set for me. She showed me that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength." "She'll be happy to hear about this," Sandra said. "I'll make sure the prosecutors know your position. We'll work something out that focuses on rehabilitation rather than punishment." They exchanged a few more words before ending the call. Dr. Miller sat at his desk for a moment longer, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. The burden of anger he'd carried for so many years had finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, something that felt a lot like hope. The evening sun cast long shadows through Carol's living room windows as she sat with Sandra and Jordan. They had gathered for dinner, but the conversation had naturally turned to the remarkable events of the past few weeks. "I still can't believe how everything turned out," Sandra said, shaking her head in amazement. "When I think back to that night in the hospital, seeing you bleeding and ignored..." She paused, her voice catching slightly. Jordan nodded, setting down his coffee mug. "I was ready to throw everything I had at that case, all my legal training, every connection I could find." Carol smiled gently at her son and niece. "And now look where we are. Dr. Miller found his path to healing, and in doing so, he helped heal others too." "Including himself," Sandra added thoughtfully. "The way he handled finding Randall, I never expected that kind of compassion from him." "That's what real change looks like," Carol said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "It's not just words or promises, it's actions that show the heart has truly transformed." Jordan leaned forward, his expression serious. "But Aunt Carol, doesn't it bother you? What happened that night could have been so much worse." "Of course it bothers me," Carol replied softly. "Forgiveness doesn't mean we pretend the wrong never happened. It means we choose not to let that wrong define our future or poison our hearts." Sandra reached for her aunt's hand. "I understand that better now. When I saw how Dr. Miller chose mercy with Randall, it finally clicked. He learned from your example." "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself," Carol mused. "Dr. Miller had to face his own prejudices, his own pain. That takes real courage." The room fell quiet for a moment as they absorbed her words. The distant sound of children playing outside filtered through the windows. "You know," Jordan said slowly, "I always respected your faith, Aunt Carol, but I never really understood its power until now." Carol smiled warmly. "Faith isn't just about believing in God. It's about believing in the possibility of change, in the power of love over hate. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, Carol added softly, her voice carrying the weight of deep conviction. Sandra and Jordan exchanged glances, seeing their aunt in a new light. Her wisdom hadn't come from books or degrees, but from a lifetime of choosing love over bitterness, hope over despair. "You've taught us all something precious," Sandra said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Not just about forgiveness, but about the kind of person we want to be." Jordan nodded in agreement. "Your strength isn't in fighting back, but in showing a better way forward. That's real power." Carol squeezed both their hands, her heart full of love for these two passionate defenders of justice who had learned to balance their drive for accountability with compassion. If you enjoyed the story of Carol, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.